Welcome to episode 7 of the Rugged Wisdom Podcast. Today we're having a conversation with a guy by the name of Tyler Moon. Now, I ran across Tyler's story on Runner's World magazine, and also Today.com did a feature on Tyler. So what caught my attention was the headline, "Man wearing the runner's bib, Jesus saves, is saved during the race by a guy by the name of Jesus," or Jesus. Well, it's a really cool story. I can't wait for you to hear it. Let's jump in now. Welcome to the Rugged Wisdom Podcast, hosted by myself, Scott Johnson, and my buddy, Joe Wedra. Join us each week as we discuss timeless truths, share great stories, and create momentum in our daily lives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share wherever you enjoy this podcast. We greatly appreciate it. And now, let's get on with the show.
Welcome back into Rugged Wisdom. Joe Wedra, Scott Johnson, and Scott, we have a fun interview today.
Yeah, we do. So we've got Tyler Moon with us today. And Tyler, welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys. It's great to be on today.
Man, we're glad to have you because you have a story that we want to share with our audience and with our listeners because it's a really cool story, but it's a story that has some incredible impacts, not only for you, but how God's using your story. And so I know I first ran across your story. I want to think it was Runner's World magazine, maybe. I saw an article there, and then it was on the Today show. I picked up a video from that, or an article, rather it was. And so we wanted to get you in today and just let you tell your story about what happened with you and what you're doing with that. So Tyler, just bring your audience up to speed, who you are, and just take us to that moment that was that crisis in your life that kind of changed your life forever.
Yeah, for sure. So as you mentioned, I'm from Minneapolis area, so I'm up here, live with my wife. In our later 20s, we have a dog, so we're kind of I guess we consider ourselves pretty normal young couple up here. But a few years ago, we had a really crazy incident that happened, and it was something that we never, ever expected. When I was about 25 years old, I signed up for a 10-mile race, which was kind of a new thing for me. I've been a football player for most of my life, and at one point in time, I thought I'd be a good runner. And so I just decided to get into running and ended up signing up for this 10-mile race. And it was called the Twin Cities 10-mile. Up here, we have the Twin Cities, which is Minneapolis and St. Paul. So you start in Minneapolis, you run 10 miles, and you finish at the capital in St. Paul. And for on that specific day, something happened to me that was just wild. Shortly after I crossed the 8th mile, so I'm like 2 miles from the finish line, I suffered a sudden cardiac arrest, which is something that is really, we didn't know anything about until we were in the hospital. But basically, it's an electrical issue with your heart that causes your heart to go out of the normal rhythm, which caused me to collapse and basically be in the line between life and death. And for me, I had, fortunately, I know we'll get into it, a group of about a dozen people, runners and volunteers and people that were just watching the race that just jumped in and gave me CPR for like 10 or 15 minutes before an AED came on site, shocked my heart back into rhythm, and rushed me off to the hospital. So that's the short version of it, and happy to share whatever I can to get the group encouraged today.
Yeah, so when I was telling Joe about your story, the one thing that stuck to me is like you're 25 years old, right, when this happened. And that's kind of right at I would say, at the bottom side of the guys who watch this show. A lot of 24, 25-year-old guys. Joe, you're 24.
24, yeah.
And, so is this something, Tyler, that was there any indication or any precursors or any kind of warning, or did you have any kind of pre-existing conditions that made you aware of that?
No, nothing. Yeah, I mean, most of my life I played sports. I played football in college and, super active, I was running before this, years training for this or months training for this race, but I've been running for a few years. So no inclination, nothing that could ever really have prepared us for that.
I think that's what's startling about your story is like a lot of guys out there right now, they're 25, 35, 45, just running along. We run, we exercise, and we have that I'm going to live forever mentality,
Right.
And
right.
I think this is in a way, a good sobering story, but what God can do with that. So there was an interesting there was a headline in one of the articles that I saw about your story that it had to do with your race bib. Let's talk about your race bib. And I want to talk about, let's get to that moment, and then I want to talk about the people who came to rescue. Why did you choose what you chose to have on your race bib?
Yeah, so if you do a quick Google search, Tyler Moon running, you'll find the race bib. But Originally, when I signed up, I put my name on my race bib, which is a common practice people do, because when you're running, it's nice to have your name on your bib so people can say, "Hey, Tyler, good job. 9 miles left. You got it, buddy." And when you're sucking wind or whatever. So that's kind of the general thought. But for me, I did that. And then one day I just got home from work, parked my car. I like vividly remember this, parked my car outside my house. And I feel like now it's a thought from the Holy Spirit that was like, "Hey, you should change your race bib to something that's just more like about Jesus, more Christian." And I was like, "That's cool, man. I think that's a good idea. I'll think about it." And so that afternoon I just went to my room and thought about it. And I came up with the words, Jesus saves. And in my mind, I'm like, this is great. Like, Jesus saves for eternity. If someone sees that, maybe they think about that. They think about their salvation. So like, thought that was a really good idea. And when everything happened, it was like, oh my gosh, like Jesus saved you physically on earth, which was pretty cool.
Yeah.
But then after everything happened with the hospital and everything, we had some news reporters that came to us and started talking to us and trying to find information about what happened. And through that process, we figured out that one of the guys who gave me CPR, he goes by the name of Jesse, but his legal name is actually Jesus. And so
Wow.
it's Jesus, which is just crazy. And then we had talked to Jesse beforehand, and he didn't mention anything about it or anything, So it was like, it just was this like crazy thing that came out in the paper, and then it went on to Twitter and Reddit. And I think that's how it got to, Runner's World and all that stuff, is because this, a crazy story that you probably couldn't even make up. Just happened in real life.
Yeah, well, that was the headline that I saw, was the Jesus saves is saved by a guy by the name of Jesus, or when you're reading it in English, I think that's really cool. I love how God, the Holy Spirit, put that on your heart, and you were responding to that, and and that was a step of obedience, and here we are. How many years has it been since that incident?
Just about 3.5.
3.5.
Yeah,
so
we're
we're
up on 4.
Yeah, so we're almost 4 years later, and we're still talking about your obedience to the Holy Spirit in that moment. So tell us about the people who came to your aid on the race course and how that played out for you.
Yeah, so it was a group of basically strangers. So in this race, it's like there's like 20 or 30,000 people that run this race, and this is pre-COVID. So, but there's people everywhere, right, running through the city, and so there's a ton of people all around. And from what I've been told, because I don't have any memory of how it happened. So what I've been told was I was running, I took a big gasp of air, just like this huge gasp of air, and then I collapsed like a ton of bricks and fell in a way that was just really unnatural. I landed on my face and just looked really bad. And so people that were around just saw me. And what happened was a bunch of people that knew CPR, people that worked in the medical field or were volunteer firefighters or whatever it was. And those people just, God just really tugged on them to come and help me. And they flipped me over and they started talking to each other in kind of like medical language. Hey, check the femoral pulse and check this, check that. And they all kind of picked up like, okay, we all know what we're doing here. And then they just started, like someone made the call to do it, and they started giving me CPR like you would, almost like you would in a operating room. And so there's not really much to it was this group or that group, but it was just a bunch of people that God called to step up and save my life.
First of all, incredible. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. When I think about this, I'm curious, and I'm sure you've answered this before, but the day itself, the morning of getting ready, the preparation. When I think about entering things like this, I think about the preparation. Like, it's exciting, it's nerve-wracking, it's terrible sometimes, like you're preparing. What do you remember about the preparation, and do you remember anything from the day itself up until the point that everything happened?
Yeah, so the day of, I stayed over. So my wife and I, we were engaged. So I stayed over. She was in her room. I was living in the living room. And then the morning of, we got up super early, and she picked me up, and we drove downtown Minneapolis. And Minneapolis is a great city and beautiful skyline. I remember just being so excited for the day, but also really nervous because I'd never run this far in my life. And I had trained a bunch, run 2 weeks before this. I'd run just about 8 miles. I ran through a bunch of, hills and trails and stuff. So that morning of, I was super excited, and it was kind of one of those beautiful Minnesota days, which is 40-degree, 50-degree fall day. Those beautiful days, right? A fall day that was just beautiful. So the day of, it was so much excitement, waking up and getting dropped off and being downtown and seeing everything. And the last memory that I have of the race is a great one. It's at mile 1. So I ran 7 miles that I don't have much memory of, but it was mile 1. I gave Amy, my fiance, my wife now, a hug. I saw my parents, and I kept running. And for me, God just blessed me with that final memory, because the next thing I know is I'm in the hospital, and it's just a pretty wild memory to have.
Right. So that's kind of a gap there. You remember running, you remember falling over, that kind of thing. You wake up in the hospital. How did you take that news? I mean, you're 25, and to this point, like, man, I'm healthy. I'm like a normal guy. I'm just out here with my fiance, living life. And, how do you hear that news? Because that news that you heard when you woke up changed your life. Because of that, there were some procedures that followed after that, right, with a defibrillator and some other things. So what is that? When you hear the news that changes your life, how did you take it, and how did you respond?
Great question. So, excuse me. It's a great question. So for me, it's kind of confusing, but when they told me, I wasn't really like all there. So they told me a bunch because I kept forgetting, and then I would kind of cry, and then I would get upset, and then I would cry. So the moment that they told me, they had to keep telling me over and over again. But by the time that I kind of came to, I would say, when I really kind of understood it, I just was grateful. Like, honestly, like, I was just so thankful to be alive. And I think it's only by the Holy Spirit that we were able to sit in the hospital room and just be smiling and happy. And, I'm sitting there in a bed with all these wires attached to me, but I couldn't be any happier, right. So I think hearing the news was tough. And we didn't know what it meant for, I love athletics and sports and fitness. But at that point in time, it wasn't that important. Like, what was important was I had my future wife and my parents, and we're all in the hospital room together. Mm-hmm. And so when people ask me about that, I'm like, there's just so much peace in that hospital room that it only could be done by the Holy Spirit, because that's not of my own flesh. Like, I'm not ready for that type of peace. So when I really kind of came to, it was joy. And we had to work through a lot of stuff after the hospital, like emotional, mental trauma, and especially with my wife, like figuring out how to work through some of that stuff. But in the moment, just grateful to be alive.
That strikes me about your story is just that idea of peace afterwards. Because I don't think that if we were to ask many of us what you think the approach would be afterwards, I don't think that's what would come to mind. But I'm curious your thoughts too. But like, to hear this from you, Tyler, this idea of like, we're at peace. I'm thankful to be alive. Like, where did that? I mean, obviously a foundation was set to have that perspective after such an event like this. I mean, where does that, in your best, the best way to describe it, where did that come from? Because that's something that's built, I believe, over time. That's not just a perspective that we can have.
Sure.
Where does, for you, Tyler, where do you think that came from? Because I would say abnormal, but fantastic.
Yeah, great question. I think it's a great call out too, Joe, about the foundation that was built. So I grew up in a great Christian home. But I didn't really feel like I capitalized on like taking my faith as my own until like after college. And really, I didn't mention this to you guys, but I lived in Charleston for like a year, and loved it down there. It was a great time, but I didn't have really any friends, and I worked kind of like a weird working shift. But what really happened was I read the Bible in a full year, and that really changed my life, because I'd never really read the full scriptures kind of on my own. I feel like I plucked passages and kind of like took the things that I thought were important, and I had a good base. But really, when I was on my own, it was like, oh man, like if I'm not living for Jesus, then like, what's my life about? And that was kind of that moment. So the time I was about 22, 23. So for like 2 or 3 years, I think I was really invested in, up until today, like really focused on just surrendering my life and doing things in a way because that's what God wanted me to do. And so fortunately for me, I found a great church in Charleston, and then moved back to Minneapolis and found a great church up here. So we were really rooted before everything happened, which made it a lot easier. I think of Jesus talks about living your life built on the rock or on the sand. And so I think we were already built on the rock, because it's not a matter of if storms come, but when the storms come. And so for me, we were very fortunate, my wife too, blessed to be able to be rooted and built on rock before the storm came.
Tyler, that part of your story really hits home with me, because I'm 24, as we've talked about before, but I always, and a big part of this podcast is to just talk about, obviously the name of it, rugged wisdom, but having a foundation, having something that you can fall back on. And when you're telling that story of taking your faith seriously after college, for me, it was in college. And I found this moment where I leave home. I grew up in a Christian household, but I didn't really feel like it was my own until I had to go. I had to go somewhere else, and I went to Chapel Hill in school, and I had to just go for it to become my own.
Right.
And when you talk about that, I just think, wow, that is exactly what I always talk about is, and I think this can be applicable not just for someone in this age group, but it has to become your own. And I think I love the idea that you said that peace, that just feeling of, okay, I understand all this, I know where I'm going, comes from having, and I'm curious kind of your thoughts on that too, of like, wow, how cool is that to hear? Because for me, it struck very personally.
Yeah, it reminds me of a saying, you've heard me say it a lot, is adversity is a classroom. That's something I kind of, kind of live by. And it's when we hit these moments of adversity is when you find out like, yeah, I'm either going to learn or life is going to learn me something, you know, like I'm going to learn from it, or life's going to learn me a lesson here. But, I think there is a moment in a man's life, especially when you kind of go away, live somewhere different, do something different, you're on your own, you're making your own decisions, where that is a form of diversity because you don't have the confines of home, you don't have the support network that you had there, where you really have to, in a real way, figure out, well, who am I and what will I do and how I'll respond to life as it happens. So Tyler, for you found yourself in a place where you had, I think God put you in a place where a season in Charleston. It was Charleston, South Carolina, where you're at?
Yes, sir.
Oh,
Yep,
awesome.
yep.
That's 2 hours from here,
right
down the road. Where that gave you a season where you're finding out, who am I? Like, who am I? And because that set you up in a way that you're responding. And that's what I'll talk about now, is because the way that you're responding because the fact that you had a medical episode doesn't make you special, right? What I mean by that is like, well, it's randomized in a way, right? Obviously some genetic things there, but it's like we all get our turn at tragedy. We all get our turn at hardship, but what you do with it, right? So tell us now how you've been able to use it. You said something in a moment ago, that it wasn't later till like the media picked up on it. Because that was the headline that I saw, was the Jesus say. I saw the green bib. We'll probably draft this up on the screen right now, but this seems like the media had a response to it as well. And I'll ask you two questions. The first one is, let's talk. What was your response with the media? Was there skepticism? Was it kind of like looked at it like was it just clickbait? Did you feel like you were the centerpiece of clickbait? And I want to ask you that question about that response, and then what you've been able to do, you and your wife, what you've been able to do with that. So let's talk about that. Like, how was the media response? And I mean, Jesus saves. It's something that they heralded. So like, that's a question for you.
Yeah, great questions, and they tie really well in together. So this is a great double up question. So the first one it was kind of unique. So when everything happened, there was a reporter took a photo of, if you Google it, you'll see them kind of giving me CPR, and it was a reporter that took a photo of it while he was running the race, and he posted on Twitter or something like, this thing happened. So people knew about it, but no one knew my name, no one knew anything about me because my name wasn't on my race bib and they weren't allowed to release my information. So no one knew anything about me. And so we had to kind of sit on it, and someone from one of the hospitals we were at was like, hey, I think he was kind of wanting to run a story of some sorts, but he was like, hey, if you want to release your name, like you can, and then like we can get things going. And so we talked about it a lot and prayed about it, and we thought, okay, like this could be a really cool way to share like the gospel. Like there aren't many people like that have a story like this. And so we decided to, okay, we'll let our name go. And I didn't know, what to expect, right? But basically within maybe 24 hours, we had one of like the top newspapers here call me. And it was like, hey, I'm so-and-so, want to run a story on you. I'm like, oh, that's cool. And then like, 20 minutes later, another newspaper calls me. And it was just like one after the other, and then news stations and multiple stations. And it was just crazy that people were so interested in the story. And at times it kind of did feel like a little bit of a piece of clickbait, because it's like, well, you just want me to say this and say that. So I was very much like, Jesus saved me, trying to keep it like real with them about Jesus, and trying to not to sugarcoat like, I believe in this one person. No, like trying to keep it really real, that they couldn't really edit things out or change things up, that they could maybe splice it up. So that was important to me, to be able to share honestly and truthfully, but I wasn't about to like not share, because that's an amazing opportunity to share. So it just kept getting bigger. And then like NPR called, and today.com like reached out, like it just kept getting bigger. And maybe to intro into next question if I can, but basically because of all the positive feedback that we got from people seeing the news stories. So we would tell the story to the news would report it, and then we get like a flood of emails or calls or texts that people were like, wow, that really touched me. That really kind of encouraged us to where we are today to kind of keep sharing, which I can get into if you have any follow-ups, but that kind of encouraged us to keep going.
Yeah, that's our follow-up is, so we saw the media response and how you were able to leverage that. And I'm sure there was some, that was kind of some tricky navigation. One thing that you said, I want to highlight, Tyler, what I think I heard you say. You were trying to present the gospel in such a way that put Jesus's name on it, in a way that so someone couldn't like cut it up, clip it up, and you're like, well, or to use it. So kudos for you for the right handling of the gospel and that. And so, that's, we got to be as wise as a serpent and subtle as a dove to a degree. So I can respect that maneuvering, but it seems as if it was effective. So it seems to me, 4 years hindsight, that you've handled it well. Continue talking about what you and your wife have been able to use this as a platform. And I like, for example, your email. Like, so your email is Moon Family Ministries, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So we talk about, so when I saw that, I'm like, okay, he has decided to take this and use it for the good of the gospel. So tell us about what you and your wife have been able to do. And you can talk about the dog too, because I know you got a dog and well, you're your dog dad. So tell us what you've been able to do with this as a platform.
Yeah, for sure. So right after, this happened 2019 in the fall. And then my wife and I got married in 2020, like early 2020. And right away we had a few opportunities. People were like, hey, come and speak. We want you to come speak at this youth event. Or I spoke at my home church up in Minnesota. And so that was really cool to kind of just dip our toes into it. And then all of a sudden COVID happened, and it was like, all right, there's not really much going on. Like, the story isn't as prominent anymore because there's a lot of bigger things going on right now. And so for a while, we just kind of hung out, and, I think God was working in the background trying to prepare my heart to start doing some speaking things. And so over the next, I don't know, maybe a year or so, I kept running. So we continued to run, and we saw that as the opportunity. Like, maybe I can't go speak right now, but I can keep running. I can keep kind of encouraging people, not just through speaking, but through action. And so I ran a marathon about a year after my cardiac arrest, which was pretty cool. And you guys might find this interesting. It was 18 degrees outside. And
so, all right, let me pause for a second and ask you a question. Okay.
Yes.
You ran, was that your first official race since the episode? But it was the longest distance for sure.
Yeah. So
that takes I mean, that's kind of that's a leap, right? Sorry. Well, I'm going to get back at it. Right. So kudos for getting back out on the race course.
Yeah. And that was something that we talked about, was because, this whole thing happens, right? And I tell people like, hey, well, before I get into it, so we did run again. So right after I had my cardiac arrest, we went back to the spot where I fell, and we finished the last 2 miles together, because that was important to us to finish it. We were medically clear. We don't do anything without medical clearance, medically cleared to run. So I ran the last 2 miles, which is kind of like an unofficial finish to the race. And then a year later, we thought about running this marathon. And when I was telling people about it, they would kind of look at me like, bro, like, you like almost died last time you ran. Why would you do that? And, it was something that and it's hard maybe for non-Christians to understand it, but it's like when God puts a burden on your heart, it's like you just feel like you need to do it, and you want to do it. You willingly do it. And so I felt like it was a burden. And I think to be able to run a marathon, so it's like, oh yeah, he fell during a 10-mile, he almost died, and he came back and did something bigger and better. But it wasn't because of what I did. It was because of what God did in me and through me. And so that was kind of the background story behind that. And so we did that again, and there was, news coverage, and people were excited again. And so I think we kind of saw the power of that. And then as COVID kind of, loosened up a little bit, we were able to kind of get into some mostly Christian organizations, Christian schools, or Fellowship of Christian Athletes events and things like that I have been able to do the last couple years, maybe about the last year or so, which has been really fun to create content. So it's mostly about my story, but it's catered to FCA's more athletics. School stuff is a little bit more catered for the school hours. So it's been really cool to kind of share that and do it with Amy too, because I think it's incredibly powerful when we show up together at an event, a married young couple, and then when she's able to speak to her side of the story, because throughout all of our lives, you mentioned, Scott, that we're all going to have tragedies, but we're always going to be on the other side too, of like supporting somebody in a tragedy. So for, whether it's men or women, to see my wife share about her experience, I think that brings a whole different level of completeness to the story that I think is really powerful.
Tyler, we're going to take a quick break. I want to talk more about this, the ministry, and I do want to give a dog shout out. I mean, I have a fun fact that he has. So we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with Tyler Moon. All right, we're back here, Rugged Wisdom. We led into talking about dogs. We had a dog question, and I know something about you, Tyler. You said before we talked and we went on air that you have a golden doodle. My family raises golden doodles, so I immediately I was like, Tyler's awesome. Like, I really like cool. Tyler. I mean, tell me about the dog and
I have a connection to that as well. When you finish, Tyler, I want to drop something in there as well.
This is not a dog podcast.
It's not a dog podcast, but if there are dog sponsors that want to be a part of that, then
our social handles will be somewhere.
We'll take care of that.
Tell me about the dog, Tyler.
For sure. So it's funny. So golden doodle. So I actually was allergic to dogs as a kid, and so my parents ended up getting a golden doodle, and for a while people were like, what kind of dog is that? Like, we lived in somewhat of a rural area, so they were like, what kind of dog is a golden doodle? And now they're all over the place, right? Like they're just all over Minneapolis. But our doodle, Minnie, she's 2 years old. She's a great dog, about 42 pounds, super smart, super playful. I call her, now we're Vikings fans up here, but she's the Justin Jefferson of Frisbee. Like, this sister can catch anything. And so it's been really fun to get to know her and kind of stretch our skills as dog parents, which has been fun. And one of the unique things about the story too is being able to kind of use her as a tool, a ministry tool. And so we're investigating what it looks like if she can be a therapy dog and bring her into maybe some hospital settings or clinic settings. And we know there's some really powerful things that happen when people get connected to a dog.
And that's my connection right there, Tyler, is back, it's been a couple years ago now, and my wife's getting mad at me if I can't tell you that date. But so it's been about 4 years ago. My son was rushed to the hospital on an air flight, on a helicopter, and he was in DKA. He was onset of a type 1 diabetic, and we were in the pediatric ICU. And we were there, and it was a life-changing. It has been a life-changing episode for our family. But they brought in a golden doodle therapy dog. They were bringing in several dogs into the ICU for the kids. Yeah. And it changed the whole room when the dog came in, and my son Wyatt, the dog came up and just interacted with him. And I'm pretty sure it was I'll find a picture and put it up there. But anyway, this dog came in, and I'd never given a lot of thought to the role of animals in that way until I saw my son interact, and that led us to get a dog later. We didn't get a Labradoodle, we got a Beagle, but it led us to a place to realizing how therapeutic the dog could be. So that was a little bit of a side take, but because we talked about this on the phone yesterday about the role that your whole family plays in ministry. So let's keep going with that, about as far as what you've been able to do, especially around that realm.
Yeah, it's been just amazing to be able to do it, and to do it as a family. I know not all ministries can be family focused, but for me and for us, it was really important for us to do it together. And so I really have a passion. When we got our dog too, I'm like, this dog was created by God. Everything here is created by God. So how can we use it for God's glory? And so to have that mindset with the dog has been really fun. And whether or not it works, like, we don't want to force her into being a therapy dog, but she's not going to be great, but we might as well try. And we know then she can still be a great family dog and bring glory to God in that way too.
That's awesome. Now, one of the things that we want to ask you about is your mindset, because you alluded to earlier, you went through a season of life, especially maybe kind of some foundational times, but you were in Charleston and then moved back to Minnesota, Minneapolis, in that area. That there was a foundation. And Joe touched on that there's a foundation that creates a particular mindset. What is it that you think in the way that you see the world, or your mindset, that helped you respond to tragedy the way that you did?
Yeah, mostly just that Jesus is Lord, and that if we trust him and we give him the honor and the grace and the perspective that he is Lord and that we trust him, that like when we give up that control to him, that everything's going to work out in the way that's honoring to God. It doesn't always mean that it's going to be perfect for you and me here on earth, but I think just recognizing that Jesus is Lord is just such a big foundational part, and really just cause us to surrender so much to him, really everything, and allow him to work before we even need to step in and be obedient to it.
Tyler, you make a point there about the two words you use, control and surrender. That is something that I think really stands out, because you seem to have this mindset of, I am willing to openly surrender. I am willing to give up control, like you said. But how challenging is that? And I kind of go back to this, but in our society, I think that's a difficult thing to say, hey, I'm going to surrender this. I'm going to give up control. You say, Jesus is Lord. I'm giving up control. I'm surrendering. It's easy to say. I'm speaking to myself. It is easy to say, but very challenging to do. And I'm just curious if you could expand on that and your mindset of surrender, your mindset of, I don't need the control. I trust in Jesus, and he is the one that can control my life. I mean, I'm curious if you could expand on that and just your mindset there.
For sure. So, Joe, I think in a lot of times in my life, I've tried to control it, and every time I fail. Every time I get to the end frustrated and upset. And so it's been a long sanctification is probably the churchy word I would use to get to this point. Right. But I think in my life, I've tried to say, okay, if I go to this college and I get this job, or I get this girl to date me, and then we'll move to this house, and then we'll get a dog, and we'll have 4.5 kids, and this will be perfect, and it'll be great, and whatever. And then I get to the end and I feel, one, it usually doesn't happen. So now I'm upset and I'm frustrated, I'm angry. And I think over the time of doing that over and over again with whatever situation it might be, I really was brought to my knees to say that, no, like, you just trust God. You can have dreams and hopes and stuff, but then lay them at the feet of Jesus and allow him to work through it. And I think that's kind of like my personal story. And the scriptures are really full of that type of stuff, is surrendering it to God. And I love Paul. Like, we talk about Paul, 2 Corinthians 11 and 12 is when Paul says, for when I'm weak, then I am strong. And that whole verse is just great, because Paul basically tells you how great he is and how much stuff has happened to him. And then he tells you, but I am nothing.
Right.
And it's only when we empty ourselves that then we're able to be filled with Christ.
What I love about that, especially when you think about it through the lens of the Apostle Paul, is that in a way, we want to kind of engineer our life. We want to engineer our life plan, that kind of stuff. But interestingly enough, not all the time, but a lot of the time, the most impactful ministries that I see people engaging in are a response to something that they never thought they would see themselves doing. Which, like, that's the story of Paul, right? This whole Damascus road, like that, he had a Damascus road, you had a Minneapolis, the Prince Road,
Yeah. Yes.
So, but there was a moment where everything changed, and it seems like Tyler, you could plot your life, plan your life, all these things, all his hopes and dreams, but it seems like where God does his greatest work is in those times when you ask the question, what is losing control? I would think laying face down on your stomach on a race course, out of control, you're that moment when God says, I'm in control, was kind of a setup for you to go, like, I can trust a God who is sovereign, who understands, sees, and knows, right? And so I commend you for finding that your calling can be as a response to what God's doing, even in tragedy, and not the way, like, you want to engineer your life. I think that's especially for young guys that are listening.
Yeah.
Like, be open that God might change your plans. Yeah. Right? And so would you say, Tyler, your life has been dramatically changed in some degree prior to this incident than after, as far as your view of calling and living on mission?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I never even thought about being in the ministry really, or like in a more official sense. Like, kind of, we all have our own ministries, but to have a more official ministry until this happened. And it was really just because of the impact that we saw. And, oftentimes in my life, I feel like when I try to engineer something versus when God does it, God's way is so much better. Like, it comes out with a better result, and it's not always easy, right? Like, that's always hard to be obedient, but to be able to come out on the other side of this, my life is way better. My marriage is way better. Like, we don't know what it would have been like, but it's just amazing what God has done through us.
I'm curious, I actually have a question for you when talking about what Tyler just said. Speaking to younger people, I think this message, the idea of control and surrender, is difficult for everybody. I mean, like you mentioned, Tyler, it's a challenge. I again commend you for having that perspective. Would I have had the same perspective? I'm not confident I could say that. It's very impressive. But when you're talking to let's say the younger generation, just for a broad term.
Old people like me.
I wasn't going to say it, but when you're talking, it's a hard concept, I think, for younger people to grasp, to say, hey, just what Tyler just said, it's so much better when you just let go. Like,
Sure
we
is.
have this challenge of, it's an everyday thing, and I know for all of us, but man, if I could just get my hands on it and do it, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
But it's very tempting. How challenging is it? And what's your message generally to younger people and a younger generation to say, listen, you don't have to control it. It will be better if you don't.
I think there are two lies that are easy to believe. One is said, if I don't, it won't mentality. Now, I think that we should plan like we've never prayed and pray like we've never planned simultaneously for our life. I think that's like, okay, God, I trust you're going to do everything, but I know that I need to do everything that I can to partner with you with that. So I think there's a lie that says, if I don't, it won't. Like, everything depends on me, which I think is can be debilitating when we understand the role of God's work in our life and what God wants to do with us. So just leave space for God to change the plan, right? And leave space for God to do that. That's part of the control. Like, I got to do everything. Yeah. But things get better. And Tyler, I don't know if your life, but I know in my life, it seems like the teams that I work with and the people that I operate with on a daily basis, when I get my hands off of some things and realize that there are people who just do things better than I do, and like, I'm going to relinquish and let other people who are skilled differently from me, and like you end up with such a greater outcome with that. And so I want to ask you a question about that real quick, Tyler. Working with your wife, Amy, correct? In the ministry, I'm sure she's gifted in ways that you're not gifted, and vice versa. How does that interaction been, and what has she been able to kind of find in her strengths and weaknesses through this, and amplify that through this journey? Who's walking beside you?
Yeah, great question. And Amy is really good with people. Like, she can kind of just understand people, and she vibes with people really well. And I consider myself more of an introvert, where she's the extrovert, and so bringing her along, she just lightens up the room. And so, like, just when we meet people, it's always great. But she's really good about, when I prep my speeches, she kind of sits there and goes, do you think that's relevant? Do you think that, she kind of pokes, and I was frustrated as I get sometimes. I'm like, I worked on this, yada, yada. Like, but you're right. And like, that's like one of the reasons that we work together, is because that she makes it better. Right. And so that's one of her special skills, is just people skills, and understanding people is awesome.
I love that you found what scripturally we would call a helpmate, right? And we talk about that Genesis chapter 2 situation. God looks at man and was like, he sees old boy by himself and is like, he needs some help, Old boy needs some help. It ain't gonna work. Yeah, it ain't gonna work. Old boy needs some help, and he brings people like that are along, who are a helpmate to help us to rule and reign and bring about the dominion of God here on this earth. So, Tyler, I'm just so thankful we've had a chance to talk to you today. I know Joe's going to kind of take us out on this, but I want to, something that I was inspired by reading your story and just kind of doing some background research. I'm like, this is a great reminder. Number one, like, you're not invincible. Like, that's probably another lie that as men we need to confront. We said this on a different episode. Every man knows he's gonna die, but not every man lives with that in mind. It's just a gut check of mortality was a good thing. I read it. I was like, yeah, because I do a lot of stupid races, and I disappear for days on end into crazy places. And I think like nothing's ever going to happen to me in a way, but it was a great gut check to remind myself, like, life is fragile, and, enjoy it, but live with that fragility in mind. That was a good gut check. And so, Tyler, I appreciate your story, at least for me, and hopefully for our listeners, would remind them of that, but also to live on mission and purpose that could be found not in my plans, but in maybe God has like a plan for my life that he may have to shake me. And I hope that every man doesn't find themselves in a Tyler situation where you're laying face down on the asphalt, having strangers revive you. I hope that it's more subtle of a tipping point in a man's life, but to be aware of them and to see that God can use your circumstances for his glory. And so, Tyler, I appreciate that. And just, Joe, your response to that?
Well, my first response is that I'm going to make sure all my Green Bay Packer fans won't listen to this because they might not like that you're a Vikings fan.
The purple people eaters and all that good stuff.
I know, but
Right.
no, it's great. I really appreciate it. Tyler, real quick, tell us anything you need to, where can we go, hear more about your story, more about what you're doing, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so we have an Instagram. That's kind of our one big social media. So Moon Family Ministries posts photos and updates about us. So if you want to just follow along, we'd love that. And then two, I'm on LinkedIn. So if you search Tyler Moon, Minneapolis, or General Mills, that's my full-time job is working at General Mills. So if you want to get in touch, love to speak, do podcasts, do these types of things, encourage people. Just really want to share the story that God's given me with everybody and anybody that I can. So feel free to reach out and just let us know that you're listening.
Awesome. Hopefully get some golden doodle pictures.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Viking
Absolutely.
pictures.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Tyler, thank you so much. We'll say go Vikings and appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for being on, bud.
Tyler. Back in here, Rugged Wisdom off of the Tyler Moon interview. He was awesome.
Good dude. That was a good interview.
What was a big, I have a couple of takeaways, but what was kind of the biggest thing that stood out to you talking to Tyler?
I think the duality of his story is one, live every day with just go live, man.
Yeah.
Live like you're prepared to live. Go put something on your calendar that scares you.
Yeah.
And that's what he did. Put a race on his calendar, went out there and did a 10-mile run and didn't finish the first time.
Yeah.
And that was part of the story. But hey, and then he got back in there. And then he went and finished the last 2 miles of that race unofficially, which I thought that was pretty awesome. But live in such a way you're ready to live. Put something on your calendar that makes you feel truly alive. That's one half. The other half is a bit more somber, which live every day like you're prepared to die, which is he was given a second chance. He was given a second chance, and we don't always get a second chance. So live like you're ready to live like you're ready to die. And what I mean by that is make sure that the people around you know how much you love them. Let the people around you know today. Tell people you love them. And that's the thing for guys don't talk about.
No, we're terrible at it.
Yeah, but make sure that you let people know where you stand with them and with God, and live in such a way that you're prepared to live, and live in such a way you're prepared to die, because that's a scriptural view of life.
His optimism was kind of off the charts.
Yeah.
Particularly, I think, after he kind of described him. We talked about it in the episode, but he describes waking up, he's in the hospital room, and I think the words joy and peace came out,
Sure.
where he's just talking and he's with his wife, and it's just joy and peace. And I love that. I thought that was powerful.
He didn't really mention too that in that piece, the next conversation was, "Hey, we're going to put in a defibrillator." So he had other and subsequent surgeries to kind of give his family and him some peace of mind.
Yeah.
And so I love that he found peace from the Lord, but also peace from the medical community. Hey, we're going to do some things so that in the future, if you have another situation where your heart stops beating, we can get you started again. So I love that he found peace, not only from God, but what God does through other humans.
Yeah, and the idea of hey, we're going to use this as a ministry now. I mean, that's powerful.
Commendable.
Tyler Moon's awesome. I hope you enjoyed it. Sharing momentum, generating wisdom. That is the goal here at Rugged Wisdom.
It is.
Scott Johnson, Joe Wedra, thanks so much for listening to Rugged Wisdom.